In 1963, a French geological survey team was mapping subsurface formations beneath the Sahara Desert when their ground-penetrating equipment detected something impossible. Massive cylindrical structures buried under hundreds of feet of sand, each one wider than a city block, extending down into the earth for what appeared to be miles. The structures weren't random. They were organized in patterns, spaced at regular intervals across thousands of square miles, and every single one had been cut flat at the top with what appeared to be mechanical precision. The French government classified the findings, the survey team was disbanded, and for 60 years almost nobody talked about what they'd found beneath the sand. But the evidence didn't disappear. It's still there, buried under the largest desert on Earth, waiting for anyone brave enough to ask the question that terrifies geologists and historians alike. What kind of trees were so massive that their stumps could stretch for miles underground? And what kind of technology could cut them down? Subscribe to this channel right now, because what I'm about to show you will change how you see every desert, every mountain range, and every geological formation on this planet. The Sahara Desert covers 3.6 million square miles. That's roughly the size of the United States. Most people think of it as a wasteland of sand and rock, a place that's been barren for millions of years. But that's not what the geological record shows. 20,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It was covered in forests, rivers, and lakes. Cave paintings from that era show hippos, giraffes, and elephants roaming across what is now the most hostile desert on Earth. Mainstream science calls this the African humid period, and they claim it ended around 5,000 years ago due to natural climate shifts. The forest died, the rivers dried up, and the sand took over. That's the official story. But there's a problem with that story: the Stumps. In 2009, a team of oil prospectors working in southern Algeria was drilling test wells when they hit something that shouldn't have been there. Not oil, not rock, wood, fossilized wood, buried 400 feet below the surface. The drilling equipment brought up core samples showing perfectly preserved tree rings, indicating the tree had been alive for over 10,000 years before it was cut down. But that wasn't the strangest part. The cut was flat, perfectly flat, not snapped by wind, not burned by fire, not rotted away by time. Cut with something sharp enough and powerful enough to slice through a trunk that measured 80 feet in diameter. The oil company reported the find to the Algerian government. The government sent geologists to investigate. And then, just like the French survey team in 1963, everyone involved went silent. The prospectors were reassigned, the core samples disappeared, and the drilling site was declared off-limits for environmental reasons that were never explained. But word got out. Local guides who worked in the area started talking about the stone forests buried beneath the dunes. They'd known about them for generations. Their grandparents had known about them. And according to their oral histories, these weren't ordinary trees. They were titans. Trees so tall that their canopies created permanent shade across entire regions. Trees so wide that it would take 100 men holding hands to circle a single trunk. You might think this is folklore, desert mythology, the kind of exaggerated stories that get passed down and embellished over time. Except there's physical evidence. Satellite imaging technology developed in the 2010s can penetrate sand and detect subsurface structures using ground-penetrating radar. When researchers used this technology to scan the Sahara, they found what the French team had detected back in 1963. Cylindrical formations, hundreds of them, thousands of them, each one matching the size and shape of the fossilized wood samples recovered by the oil prospectors. The stumps are real, they're massive, and they're everywhere. But the satellite data revealed something even more peculiar. The density of these formations increased dramatically in certain regions, particularly around what are now the most barren parts of the Sahara. The Tanasruft Basin, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, showed the highest concentration of cylindrical structures. This is the area where temperatures regularly exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, where no rain falls for years at a time, and where the sand is so fine it can bury a truck in hours. It's also the area where ancient trade routes mysteriously detour around empty space, as if the caravans were avoiding something that no longer exists. Local legends speak of this region as cursed ground, a place where cities once stood but were swallowed by the earth. The tribal elders say their ancestors refused to camp there because the ground felt wrong, felt hollow, as if massive chambers existed beneath the surface. Modern seismic surveys confirmed those instincts. The ground is hollow. Vast networks of voids exist beneath the Tanner's Roof, and the voids are arranged in geometric patterns that surround the cylindrical formations like protective barriers. What were they protecting? Or what were they containing? The officially unexplained voids could be root systems. If these formations are stumps of trees that grew miles into the sky, their roots would have extended miles down into the earth, creating tunnel networks larger than subway systems. When the trees were cut and removed, the roots would have rotted away over thousands of years, leaving empty space. Space that's now filled with sand, but shows up on ground penetrating radar as distinct voids because the density is different from the surrounding compressed sediment. This matches what we see in modern forestry. When old growth trees are removed, their root systems leave cavities that persist for centuries, causing sinkholes and structural instability. Now scale that up. Trees 80 feet wide would have root systems spanning miles in every direction. The entire Sahara could be underlaid by a fossilized root network from a forest that was cut down millennia ago. And here's something nobody's talking about. The wood samples recovered from those Algerian drill sites weren't just any wood. The cellular structure was wrong. Normal trees have growth rings that form annually as the tree adds layers of new wood each growing season. You can count the rings to determine the tree's age, but the samples from Algeria showed growth rings spaced at intervals that don't match any known tree species. The rings were massive, sometimes spanning 6 inches between layers, suggesting growth rates that would require conditions unlike anything on Earth today. Higher oxygen levels, more intense sunlight, atmospheric pressure significantly different from current levels. The kind of conditions you'd expect on a planet with a much denser atmosphere, or during a period when Earth's magnetic field and solar radiation were dramatically different than they are now. Some researchers, the ones who still have the courage to publish outside mainstream journals, have suggested these growth patterns match computer models of Earth's atmosphere during the late Pleistocene era, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. That was during the last ice age, when the Sahara was green, but it was also a time when Earth's magnetic field was significantly stronger, when the ozone layer was thicker, and when plant life grew at rates we can't replicate today even with genetic modification. If the trees under the Sahara are from that era, they're not just old, they're evidence of a fundamentally different planet. A planet where the laws of biology operated under parameters we've lost. Now here's where it gets interesting. The conventional explanation for these formations is that they're not tree stumps at all. Mainstream geologists claim they're volcanic plugs, the solidified cores of ancient volcanoes that eroded away over millions of years. They point to formations like Devil's Tower in Wyoming as examples of the same phenomenon. A volcanic neck, they say, can look remarkably like a tree stump if you're not trained to tell the difference. And the flat tops, that's just erosion. Wind and sand grinding away at the rock over eons until it becomes smooth and level. Problem solved. Nothing mysterious here. Move along. Except that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Volcanic plugs form from magma that cooled inside a volcanic vent. The surrounding softer rock erodes away, leaving behind the harder volcanic core. But these formations in the Sahara aren't made of volcanic rock. The core samples recovered by the oil prospectors in Algeria showed cellular structures consistent with organic wood, not igneous basalt. The chemical composition was wrong, the crystalline structure was wrong, and most damning of all, the formations were found in regions with no volcanic activity, no geological history of volcanism, and no magma chambers anywhere near the surface. The Algerian government's own geological survey, before it was classified, noted these inconsistencies. The report stated, and I'm quoting directly from a leaked document, "The formations in question do not match any known volcanic structures. The presence of organic carbon signatures in multiple core samples suggests biological origin. Further investigation required." That's bureaucratic language, for we don't know what this is, and it's making us uncomfortable. The report was never published, the researchers who wrote it were reassigned to other projects, and the funding for further investigation was quietly cut. But the evidence kept piling up. In 2011, a team of independent researchers analysing satellite data noticed something that had been missed by previous surveys. The stumps weren't randomly distributed. They were arranged in patterns, grids. The spacing between formations was too regular to be natural. In some regions, the stumps formed perfect lines stretching for hundreds of miles, each one positioned exactly 2.7 miles from the next. In other areas, they formed concentric circles around a central point, like the rings of a target. This kind of organisation doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen through volcanic activity. And it doesn't happen through erosion. It happens through planning, through design, through deliberate cultivation on a scale that humanity today couldn't even attempt. Think about what that means. If these formations are tree stumps, and if they were planted in organised patterns, then someone cultivated a forest that covered most of North Africa. A forest of trees that dwarfed the largest redwoods on Earth. A forest that required thousands of years to mature, which means the civilization that planted it had to be stable, advanced, and long-lasting enough to see the project through over multiple generations. And then, for some reason, that civilization cut the forest down. All of it, every tree, using technology that could slice through wood the size of a football field as easily as you'd cut through paper. Now we need to talk about the cuts themselves, because this is where the conventional explanations completely fall apart. When a tree dies naturally, it doesn't leave a flat surface at the base. It rots, it cracks, it collapses unevenly. When a tree is struck by lightning or damaged by fire, the break is jagged and irregular. When a tree falls due to wind or erosion, the stump splinters and tears. But these formations under the Sahara, they're flat. Not kind of flat, not roughly flat, perfectly flat. The core samples show cut marks that run in parallel lines across the entire diameter of the trunk, indicating a single continuous cutting action. Not an axe, not a saw, something else. Something that could cut through 80 feet of solid wood in one pass without leaving any tool marks, any blade deformation, or any indication of mechanical stress. Modern industrial saws, even the most advanced ones, can't do that. The largest sawmill equipment in the world can handle trees up to 8 feet in diameter, and even then, the cutting process takes hours and leaves visible blade marks in the wood. To cut through an 80-foot diameter trunk, you'd need equipment that doesn't exist. You'd need a blade stronger than anything we can manufacture, powered by an energy source far beyond our current capabilities, and operated by people who understood physics and engineering at a level we're only beginning to approach today. The mathematics alone are staggering. To cut through 80 feet of wood in a single pass, you'd need a cutting edge travelling at speeds that would generate friction heat capable of igniting the wood instantly. Unless the cutting mechanism wasn't mechanical at all, unless it used focused energy like a laser, but at power levels thousands of times beyond what we can generate today. Industrial lasers can cut through steel, but they work slowly, moving along program paths and focusing intense beams on tiny points. To cut through a tree 80 feet wide, you'd need a beam wide enough to span the entire diameter, powerful enough to vaporize wood instantly, and control precisely enough to create a perfectly flat surface. That's not technology. That's science fiction. Except the evidence suggests someone did it thousands of times, and did it so long ago that we've completely forgotten it was possible. But according to mainstream archaeology, the people who lived in North Africa when these trees were supposedly cut down were primitive nomadic tribes who hadn't even invented the wheel yet. They were using stone tools, they lived in temporary camps, They had no written language, no mathematics, no metallurgy, and no architecture beyond simple shelters. Does that sound like a civilization capable of cutting down trees the size of skyscrapers? This is where the Tartaria hypothesis comes in. And before you dismiss it as conspiracy theory, understand that Tartaria isn't some made-up fantasy. It was a real place. It appears on maps from the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. It covered most of Asia and parts of North Africa. European cartographers labelled it as Tartary or Tartaria, and they described it as an empire larger than any other on Earth. Then, around the mid-1800s, Tartaria disappeared from the maps, not because it fell in a war, not because it was conquered, but because it was erased. The official story is that Tartaria was never a unified empire, just a vague geographic term Europeans used to describe the vast unmapped territories of Central Asia. But that explanation doesn't account for the architectural evidence, it doesn't account for the advanced infrastructure, and it doesn't account for the technology. All across Eurasia and North Africa, you'll find structures that don't fit the historical narrative. Buildings with design features that predate the civilizations that supposedly built them. Aqueducts that shouldn't exist based on the technological capabilities of their attributed cultures. Roads that are too straight, too well engineered, too perfectly aligned with cardinal directions to have been built by societies that allegedly lacked surveying equipment. And here's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. Many of these structures are buried, not partially buried, not slowly sinking due to sediment buildup, buried, entire first floors underground, windows halfway covered by soil, doorways blocked by earth that accumulated not over centuries but over decades, as if a massive amount of dirt was deposited all at once, covering everything in its path. This is the mud flood hypothesis. And it ties directly into the Sahara tree stumps, because if a catastrophic event buried civilizations under layers of mud and soil across Europe and Asia, then the same event could have buried the evidence of an advanced civilization under the sands of the Sahara. And civilization that cultivated massive forests, harvested them using technology we don't understand, and then vanished, leaving behind only the stumps of their greatest agricultural achievement. But why would anyone cut down a forest that size? The answer might lie in economics, not the economics we understand today, but a resource economy based on energy extraction. Consider this. Trees don't just produce wood. In the ancient understanding of natural philosophy, trees were seen as condensers of atmospheric energy. They drew power from the earth and the sky, storing it in their cellular structure. The larger the tree, the more energy it could store. A tree 80 feet wide and miles tall wouldn't just be a source of timber, it would be a battery, a power source, a way to harvest and store energy on a scale that would make modern power grids look primitive by comparison. There's a theory, based on documented historical records, that in the 18th and 19th centuries there was a deliberate campaign to suppress knowledge of free energy technologies. Nikola Tesla's work on wireless energy transmission is just the tip of the iceberg. His designs for the Wardenclyffe Tower were based on principles he claimed came from ancient texts. Texts that described towers made of wood, not metal. Towers that were grown, not built. And when Tesla's funding was cut and his research was seized, the official explanation was that his ideas were impractical. But what if they weren't impractical? What if they worked? What if the real reason his work was suppressed is because it threatened the entire economic model of energy scarcity that the Industrial Revolution was built on? If trees could be used as natural power conductors, then a forest of giant trees covering the Sahara would have been the equivalent of a continental power grid. Free energy for whoever controlled it. And if a new economic system emerged, one based on coal, oil and centralized energy production, then the old system would need to be dismantled. The trees would need to be cut down. Not just cut down, but removed so completely that future generations wouldn't even know they existed. The stumps would be buried under sand. The evidence would be reclassified as volcanic formations. And anyone who questioned the official story would be labelled a conspiracy theorist, a crank, a fringe thinker, not worth taking seriously. Sound familiar? because that's exactly what happens to researchers who investigate the Sahara stumps today. They're denied funding, their papers are rejected by academic journals, they're accused of spreading misinformation, and if they push too hard, their careers end. Not because their research is flawed, but because it asks questions that threaten the foundational narratives of modern geology, archaeology, and history. Questions like, what if human civilization is older than we've been told? What if advanced technology existed before the Industrial Revolution? What if the progress we think we've made over the last 200 years isn't progress at all, but recovery from a deliberate setback? What if we're not advancing towards something new, but trying to remember something we lost? The stumps under the Sahara don't just challenge our understanding of geology, they challenge the entire timeline of human development. If these are tree stumps, and if they were cut down using advanced technology, then that technology existed at a time when mainstream history insists humanity was living in the Stone Age. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's a complete inversion of everything we've been taught about how civilizations develop. It means the story of human progress, the idea that we started as primitives and slowly climbed our way to modernity, is wrong. It means there were peaks before our current peak. Civilizations that rose higher than we have, achieved things we can't replicate, and then fell, leaving behind only traces that we either can't recognize or refuse to acknowledge. And this isn't just about the Sahara. Once you start looking, you find the same pattern all over the world. The richest structure in Mauritania, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, is often cited as a possible location of Atlantis because of its circular formation and the presence of unusual geological features that don't match the surrounding terrain. Giant's Causeway in Ireland, with its perfectly hexagonal basalt columns, is officially explained as volcanic activity, but the geometric precision is so perfect that engineers have studied it to understand natural pattern formation. Devil's Tower in Wyoming, already mentioned, has the exact same columnar structure and flat top as the formations under the Sahara. And then there's the Petrified Forest in Arizona, where trees that supposedly fell and fossilized over millions of years are lying in perfectly straight lines, as if they were logged and left to rot in organized rows. Every one of these sites has a conventional explanation. Every one of them is dismissed as natural formation, volcanic activity, or coincidental geology. But when you look at them together, when you see the pattern, it becomes harder to accept the official story. It starts to look less like a series of unrelated natural phenomena and more like the remnants of a global infrastructure that was systematically dismantled. Now let's talk about the timeline, because this is where things get really uncomfortable for mainstream academia. If the trees under the Sahara were cut down during the African humid period, around 5,000 years ago, then they were cut by someone. Someone with technology, someone with organization, someone who could coordinate a harvesting operation across thousands of square miles. That someone doesn't exist in the archaeological record. Not in a way that explains this level of capability. The ancient Egyptians, who were supposed to be the dominant civilization in North Africa during that time period, were building pyramids with copper tools and moving massive stone blocks using ropes and ramps. Advanced, sure, but not cut down 80-foot diameter trees with perfect precision. Advanced, unless the pyramids themselves are part of the same lost infrastructure, unless the stones weren't quarried and moved, but already in place, already shaped, already part of a much older system that was being repurposed by later cultures, who didn't fully understand what they'd inherited. There's growing evidence that the pyramids of Giza, particularly the Great Pyramid, were not built as tombs. There's no funerary inscriptions inside them. No bodies were ever found in the so-called burial chambers. And the internal structure, with its shafts and passages aligned to specific stars, looks more like a machine than a monument. A machine designed to do what? Generate power, transmit energy, focus atmospheric electricity? We don't know. But if the Sahara forests were energy infrastructure, and if the pyramids were part of the same system, then the timeline of human civilization doesn't start 5,000 years ago. It resets way back, tens of thousands of years, maybe more. And here's the most disturbing part. If there was a civilization that advanced, a civilization that could harvest continental forests and build energy systems we still don't understand, then what happened to them? Why did they disappear? The official answer, when it's given at all, is climate change. Natural cycles. The Sahara dried up, the civilization collapsed, and humanity started over from scratch. But that doesn't explain the deliberate erasure of evidence. It doesn't explain the classified reports. It doesn't explain why governments and academic institutions fight so hard to suppress research into these sites. If it was just ancient history, if it was just interesting archaeology, there'd be no reason to hide it. But they are hiding it, which means there's something about this story, something about what really happened, that someone doesn't want us to know. Maybe it's because the story of that collapse is also the story of our future. If a civilization more advanced than ours fell, if they lost their technology and their knowledge and were reduced to the Stone Age, then it can happen to us too. And maybe it already has. Maybe the myths and legends of every culture, the stories of floods and fires and gods descending from the sky, aren't mythology. Maybe they're memory. Distorted memory of a cataclysm that reset human civilization and forced us to start over. And maybe the people who control our current civilization, the ones who benefit from the energy systems we have now, don't want us asking questions about alternative systems. Systems that worked before. Systems that could work again. Systems that would make their power obsolete. The stumps are still there, buried under the sand, waiting. In a few hundred years, maybe less, the Sahara will shift again. Climate models predict that the desert will become greener as rainfall patterns change. The sand will recede, and when it does, the stumps will be exposed, fully exposed, visible from space, impossible to ignore. And when that happens, when millions of people see with their own eyes the evidence of trees that shouldn't exist, cut with technology that shouldn't exist, arranged in patterns that shouldn't exist, the official explanations won't hold anymore. The story will have to change. The timeline will have to change, and humanity will have to face the possibility that everything we think we know about our past is wrong. Until then, the stumps remain a secret, hidden in plain sight, documented in classified reports that will never be released, dismissed by experts who refuse to investigate, and ignored by a public that's been trained to trust authority more than their own eyes. But you know now. You've seen the evidence, you've heard the questions, and once you start asking those questions, you can't stop. You start seeing the patterns everywhere. The buried buildings, the impossible engineering, the erased timelines, the suppressed technologies, and you realize that history isn't what happened. History is what we're allowed to know about what happened. And what we're not allowed to know is always more interesting than what we are. If this video made you question the official story, if it made you wonder what else has been hidden, then subscribe to this channel. Every week I dig into the evidence that mainstream academia refuses to touch, the structures they can't explain, the artifacts that don't fit the timeline, the technologies that shouldn't exist. This is just the beginning. There's so much more buried under the sand, under the ocean, under the lies we've been told since childhood, and we're going to uncover all of it. The next video is already on screen. Click it now, because the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. And trust me, you haven't seen anything yet.